There's a moment, and you have lived it, where someone looks at you across a room, across a table, across a conversation, and says something that isn't quite an accusation. It's sharper than that. It's a test, and in the half second before you open your mouth, the entire game is already decided. Most people lose it right there, not because they're weak, not because they're wrong, but because they do the one thing every reasonable, decent human being is trained to do. They explain themselves. I didn't mean it that way. You're misreading me. That's not who I am. And the moment those words leave their mouth, something shifts in the room. Something no one names out loud, but everyone feels. The person who just explained themselves has just made a confession they never intended to make. Not a confession of guilt. Something worse, a confession of need. They need you to believe them. They need to be understood. And in the architecture of power, not the kind that brutalizes, but the kind that commands, that need is the go. Machiavelli understood this with a clarity that still makes people uncomfortable 500 years later. He watched princes fall. He watched capable men lose rooms full of allies with a single anxious defense. And he wrote it down so precisely that reading him today feels less like history and more like a mirror you weren't ready for. This video is about that mirror. It's about the instinct to justify yourself, where it comes from, what it costs you, and what it looks like when someone has trained themselves out of it entirely. Stay with me, because what comes next isn't a trick. It's a reckoning with something you've probably been doing your whole life without knowing it was working against you. Let's start with what actually happens when you defend yourself, not what you intend, what actually happens. You intend to clarify. You intend to correct the record. You believe somewhere deep in the chest that if you can just get the words right, the other person will understand, the room will understand, and the whole misunderstanding will dissolve. That belief is not stupid, it's human. But in the world Machiavelli studied, and it is still that world, it doesn't work the way you think it does. When you justify your actions to someone who has challenged you, you are not giving them information. You are giving them a frame. You are stepping into their frame, and the moment you step into it, you have implicitly accepted one of the most damaging concessions in any social dynamic. You have granted them the authority to judge you. Think about what that means. The second you say, "Let me explain," you are saying, "Your assessment of me is legitimate enough that I need to address it." You've handed them the gavel, and now they're the judge and you're on the stand, even though neither of you signed up for that arrangement 5 minutes ago. Machiavelli saw this in the courts of Florence, in the halls of the Medici, in the letters of men who lost their standing not through great failures, but through small, reflexive, well-intentioned explanations. He saw that the powerful did not rush to defend themselves. They didn't need to. And that stillness, that composure, was not coldness. It was a kind of grammar, a way of speaking without words. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself, not to impress anyone, just to stay honest, put something in the Meditations that cuts close to this same nerve. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't writing about Stoic detachment as a style. He was writing about what happens to a man who has surrendered the interior to external opinion. That man becomes reactive, and a reactive man cannot lead himself, let alone anyone else. The impulse to defend yourself comes from a good place. It comes from the same place that makes you honest, that makes you care about being seen accurately, that makes you uncomfortable with lies hanging in the air unchallenged. These aren't character flaws, but they have a shadow side, and that shadow side is this. Most of the time when you rush to explain, you aren't doing it because you've calculated that it will improve the situation. You're doing it because you can't stand the discomfort of being misread. That discomfort is yours, and as long as you act from it, you are acting from weakness, no matter how right you are. Epictetus, who knew something about operating inside conditions he could not control, put it plainly. Epictetus said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." What is in your power is your response, your silence, your posture, your choice of whether to accept the framing someone else has imposed on you. What is not in your power is what they believe, and no amount of explanation changes that. People rarely update their view of you because you argued them into it. They update their view of you because they observe you over time. And what they observe, more than anything, is how you carry yourself when pressure is applied. That carrying, that composure, is what we're actually talking about here. Not manipulation, not performance, something older and more demanding than both of those. The ability to absorb accusation without becoming it. Here is something that almost nobody tells you about silence in conflict. It is not passive. We tend to think of silence as absence, the absence of argument, the absence of defense, the absence of presence. But anyone who has sat across from someone who refused to be rattled knows that stillness, something specific happens in the mind of the person who made it. They expected a response. They braced for one. They had the next move already loaded and too hard. Whether they looked emotional, whether you know something they don't, that last one is the most interesting. The human mind, when given a gap, fills it. And it almost always fills it with something larger than the truth. Your silence becomes mysterious. Your composure becomes a signal of depth. People begin to assume you are operating from a position they can't see. This is not deception. You didn't create a false impression. You simply refused to reduce yourself to a reaction. Machiavelli wrote about this with characteristic bluntness. He understood that the perception of power is often more structuring than power itself. A prince who seems unshakable becomes unshakable in the minds of those around him, and that impression has real effects. It shapes how people approach him, what risks they're willing to take, what they whisper to one another before they dare say anything to his face. Now, the Stoics arrived at something parallel through a completely different path. They weren't studying courts or princes. They were studying the interior. But they reached a very similar conclusion. Seneca wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." What Seneca is naming here is the machinery behind the attack itself. Most people who challenge you are not operating from strength. They are operating from anxiety, from a need to establish dominance because they feel it slipping, from discomfort with your composure, your quiet, your seeming indifference to their approval. When you understand that, the attack changes shape entirely. It is no longer a threat to be neutralized. It is information about the person delivering it, and you do not respond to information with panic. You observe it. There is a particular type of person, and you have met them, who never seems to take the bait, who receives slights with a kind of mild, almost amused steadiness, who, when provoked in public, doesn't tighten or defend or deflect. They simply remain exactly as they were a moment before the provocation, as if it never landed. People respect this person enormously, and they're often not entirely sure why. They might say it's confidence, but it's something more specific than that. It's the visible evidence that someone else's opinion of them is not the axis their world turns on. The Proverbs, which understood human dynamics with ruthless precision, have this to say about it. Proverbs 17:28. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is more material to work with, more angles of attack, more reveals of what you're protecting, more evidence of where the nerve is. Silence, by contrast, gives them nothing, and from nothing, they can only build their own projection, which will usually be more formidable than the real you, because human imagination defaults toward what frightens it. This is the strange arithmetic of restraint. The less you give them, the more they feel they're dealing with. Now, none of this means you go mute in every difficult conversation. There are moments that call for direct speech, for clarity, for setting a record straight. We'll get to the distinctions, but the first thing to understand, the foundational thing, is that your default setting needs to change. Most of us were trained to explain ourselves as an act of respect. I want you to see me clearly. I want you to understand where I'm coming from. That impulse is not wrong, but it has to be governed, because unchecked it becomes something else, a constant lobbying campaign for your own innocence, and that campaign costs you more than it ever wins you. Let's make this concrete, because the gap between principle and application is where most people lose the thread. You're in a meeting. a presentation you've prepared, someone across the table, not your superior, not a peer you particularly respect, says something designed to make the room question your work. It's not a real critique, it's a positioning move. They want to look sharp at your expense, and they've chosen this moment to try it. The room waits. The average response is a flood of justification. The person being challenged leans forward, voice slightly too quick, and begins enumerating the reasons their approach is sound. They cite sources. They explain their process. They look from the outside like someone who has just been asked to prove they deserve to be there. And here's the brutal thing: even if every word they say is correct, even if their work is unassailably good, the energy of the defense undermines them because they've signaled something that the logic can't walk back. They signaled that the challenge landed. The Machiavellian move is not to argue, it's to redirect. You receive the comment, you pause, not theatrically, just long enough to signal that you're not scrambling. Then, if you say anything at all, you turn the question back. Interesting. What would you have done differently? Now they have to perform. Now they're on the spot, and the room, which was watching to see if you'd crack, has shifted its attention to whether this person can actually deliver on their implied critique. You did not defend your work. You let the work stand and move the pressure elsewhere. This is what Machiavelli meant when he described the prince who never protests his goodness. The man who is secure in what he has done does not need the room's validation in real time. He can afford to wait. And that willingness to wait, while others scramble for immediate vindication, is its own form of authority. Now move this into personal life, because that's where it gets heavier. A relationship, close, years long, the kind where the other person knows exactly which words carry weight. And in a moment of their own frustration, they deliver one of those words directly at you. You don't really care anymore, do you? The person who has not learned what we're discussing here hears that and goes into immediate corrective mode. They protest. They enumerate evidence of caring. They revisit recent history to prove that the accusation is unfair. And what they've just done is taken emotional provocation, something that may have been pain disguised as attack, and turned it into a courtroom scene. They've accepted the charge. They've volunteered for the defense. And now the emotional temperature in the room is higher, not lower, because they've treated a feeling as a verdict. The calmer response, and this is harder than it sounds, is to refuse the frame without being cold about it, not to deny the feeling behind the accusation, but not to accept the framing of it either. Something quiet, something that holds ground without escalating. That's not how I see what's between us. 7 words, no explanation. No countercharge, just a clean refusal to accept the frame, delivered without heat. What happens in that moment? The other person has to sit with what they said. They have to reckon with whether they actually believe it, or whether they were testing, or whether they were hurting and pointed it outward. You've given them nothing to argue against, and that means the weight of the accusation falls back on them. Seneca has something to say about this kind of emotional steadiness that doesn't get cited often enough. Seneca wrote, "A sword never kills anybody. It is a tool in the killer's hand." The emotion that moves us is always the question. The emotion that moves you in a conflict is the hinge point. If you are moved by the need to clear your name, you will always be in someone else's hands. If you are moved, or rather, not moved, by something more interior, something more settled, the dynamic inverts entirely. This is why the Stoics spoke so much about the interior fortress, not as a metaphor for emotional shutdown, as a metaphor for sovereignty. The person who has built this kind of inner stability is not indifferent to what others say. They simply don't require those words to land a certain way in order to remain intact. James 1:19 puts it simply. James 1:19, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." This is not a verse about conflict strategy. It's a verse about interior architecture. The person who is slow to speak is not suppressing themselves. They are choosing. They are making a deliberate decision about what is worth the expenditure of their voice. And they understand that most provocations are not. You are allowed to hear something, to feel it, and to say nothing. That is not weakness. That is governance of yourself. There's a move beyond silence that Machiavelli would have called the blade turning, and it requires a specific kind of nerve to execute. You don't just refuse to defend yourself. You take the accusation and turn it into a reflection of the person making it. Not through cruelty, not through a counterattack, something colder and more precise than that. You treat the accusation as a data point, and you let the data point be visible. Someone called you arrogant. The ordinary response is defensive and immediate. I'm not arrogant, I just know what I'm good at. Which sounds reasonable but confirms everything. It says, this label has the power to sting me. I need to remove it. The alternate response is half a breath and something like, interesting that confidence reads that way to you. You haven't denied anything. You haven't confirmed anything. What you've done is quietly suggested that the problem might be in the receiver, not the sender. And you've done it without raising your voice, without visible emotion, without giving the room any signal that you were disturbed. Now watch what happens. The person who made the accusation is suddenly uncertain. They expected a fight. They prepared for a fight. And instead of a fight, they got a mirror. Their own charge reflected back with a slight tilt that makes them look rather than you. This is what Viktor Frankl discovered in conditions far more extreme than any boardroom or dinner party dispute. He noticed that the one freedom that cannot be taken from a person is the freedom to choose their response to what happens to them. And he noticed that the people who maintained that freedom, even in the worst possible circumstances, maintained something that their captors could never fully access, a kind of interiority that the outside could not dictate. Viktor Frankl wrote, between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space is everything. Most people in conflict have no space. The stimulus arrives and the response fires immediately, reflexively, without governance. They've been conditioned to react, and they react. And that reaction carries all their cards face up for anyone to read. The person who has learned to occupy that space, who can feel the provocation and still take a breath before deciding whether to answer it and how, that person is, in the most precise sense of the word, free, not free from discomfort, free from compulsion. And freedom from compulsion is the foundation of everything Machiavelli and the Stoics were actually talking about. The prince who rules himself can rule others. The man who cannot rule himself will be ruled by whoever knows which buttons to push. Now, the inversion technique has to be used with care. If you deploy it in every exchange, it becomes a tick, and people will clock it. The point is not to have a repertoire of clever deflections ready. The point is to have a settled interior from which you can respond or not respond, on your own terms. There is a difference between a person who deploys silence strategically, as a tactic, calculating its effect, and a person who is genuinely untroubled by the need to explain themselves. The first one is performing. The second one is free. The Stoics would have said that the performance, while it may look similar from the outside, is still a form of servitude. You're still orienting to the other person's opinion, just orienting around not caring rather than around caring. It's a different posture, but the center of gravity is still outside you. What they were aiming at, what this video is ultimately pointing toward, is something more interior than a technique. It's a fundamental shift in where you locate your own standard. Marcus Aurelius asked himself, and I think he meant this as a daily practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." He wrote that in a private journal. He had no one to impress, and he was still naming it as a failure of discipline, as the default error of the human being who has not done the work. The work is not learning how to look unaffected. The work is becoming less affected, which is harder, slower, less dramatic, and far more lasting. Psalm 62:1. Truly my soul finds rest in God, my salvation comes from Him. Rest, that's the word. Not performance of rest, not the imitation of peace. Actual rest. The kind that comes from locating your worth somewhere, that cannot be revoked by an accusation, a snub, a public critique, or a long silence from someone whose opinion once meant everything. When that rest is real, Silence is not a weapon you deploy. It is simply who you are when no one is testing you. Here is the part that troubles most people when they first encounter it. Machiavelli did not say, "It is better to be liked." He said it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot have both. But he also said something that gets less attention, and it's the more subversive claim. It is better to be mysterious than to be predictable. A predictable man is a controllable man. Someone who always explains himself, who always responds to provocation with justification, who is reliably defensive when accused, that person is readable. And a readable person is easy to move. You know exactly which words to use, which angles to approach from, which charges will get a rise. But the man who is not entirely legible, who receives provocation with composure, who sometimes answers and sometimes doesn't, who seems to have a longer game than anyone in the room can fully see, that person is harder to manipulate. There is a cost to engaging him that might not be worth paying. This is not about being cold or distant. It is about being interior, about having enough going on inside you that the outside cannot fully read the inside. And here is the paradox that Machiavelli saw and that most self-help culture has completely inverted. The relentless pursuit of a good reputation is itself a vulnerability, because a good reputation is something you have to protect, and anything you feel compelled to protect can be used as leverage against you. The person with a strong character, not a clean image but a strong character, doesn't need to curate their reputation in real time. They are not managing perception. They are simply being who they are consistently and trusting that over time the pattern speaks for itself. People will misjudge them. People will accuse them. People will fill in gaps with their own projections, and sometimes those projections will be unflattering. And the person of strong character will not chase those projections down and correct them because they understand something important. You cannot control what people decide to believe about you. And trying to do so is not only exhausting, it is actually counterproductive. Because the more urgently you insist on your own goodness, the more it looks like you're not sure of it yourself. There is a specific person I want you to think about. You may know someone like this, or you may have encountered one in passing. They are not the loudest person in any group. They don't explain themselves often. When someone takes a shot at them, they don't absorb it visibly, and they don't retaliate. They just seem to occupy a register of the conversation that the provocation can't quite reach. You walk away from interactions with them feeling like you didn't quite get full access, like there's a door you couldn't find. And rather than finding this frustrating, you find it quietly, almost despite yourself, impressive. That impression is not manufactured. It's the natural result of a person who has genuinely stopped needing your validation, who is oriented inward rather than outward, who has, in the Stoic language, tended their own garden. Epictetus said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." There's a social application here that Epictetus probably intended. The things which happen include being misunderstood, being accused of things you didn't do or didn't mean, being seen through a lens you didn't choose. These are simply things that happen to anyone who is visible in the world. Wishing they wouldn't happen is not a strategy. Choosing not to be destabilized by them, that is. And the interesting thing is, once you genuinely stop needing to correct the record in real time, something happens that you could not have manufactured on your own. People begin to defend you, not because you asked them to, not because you lobbied them subtly, but because your composure, your refusal to panic, your obvious lack of need for their rescue, all of that makes them want to offer it anyway. There is a kind of dignity that invites defense from others in a way that desperation never does. When someone is clearly desperate for validation, the social instinct is often to withhold it, not out of cruelty, but because the desperation itself makes the validation feel less worth giving. You can't fill that hole, but the person who is already whole, defending them feels like a choice, not an obligation. It feels like something you want to do. This is the paradox Machiavelli saw, and that scripture echoes in a different key. Proverbs 22:1. A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. A name. Not a defense of a name. Not a campaign for a name. A name that is built, slowly, quietly, through the accumulation of how you actually live, not protected in real time through anxious argument. That kind of name cannot be taken in a single accusation, because it doesn't rest on any single moment. It rests on the pattern, and the pattern speaks, even when you don't. Everything we've been discussing so far is pointing at a single question, and it's not a so comfortable one. Why do you need to be understood? Not in the abstract, specifically. When someone misreads you, when someone attributes a motive you didn't have, when someone tells a version of your story that isn't yours, what exactly is threatened? What is the thing inside you that reaches for the explanation, that needs the correction to be received, that cannot fully rest until the other person sees you accurately? Because that thing, whatever it is the actual subject of this conversation. For most people, it is some version of self-worth that has been partially outsourced, not fully, not stupidly, but enough that other people's assessments carry more weight than they should. Enough that being misread feels, on some level, like being diminished. Enough that the impulse to explain yourself is not really about them. It's about quieting something in you that needs reassurance. The Stoics called this the most fundamental error. Locating your good outside yourself. Placing the basis of your well-being in things that other people can touch. Reputation, status, approval, being understood. These are, in the Stoic taxonomy, preferred indifference. Things that are nice to have and worth pursuing in general, but never worth your peace. Never worth your freedom. Never worth the interior. Epictetus was a slave. Literally owned, controlled, physically abused, and he arrived at the conclusion that no one could touch the most important thing, because the most important thing was a choice. The choice of how to relate to what happened to him. That is not a small claim. That is a radical claim. It says that the cage and the freedom are not opposites. A man can be in chains and be interior sovereign. A man can be physically free and be a slave to what the room thinks of him. Most of us, if we're honest, are closer to the second category than we want to admit. The work, and it is work, it is not insight. It does not happen from watching one video. The work is the slow, repeated, disciplined practice of noticing when you are operating from the need for external validation and choosing to act from somewhere else instead. Not suppression, not performance of indifference, genuine interior reorientation. The building of what Paul called, in a different context, contentment. The capacity to be okay regardless of what the conditions are. Philippians 4:11. I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Learned, not received as a gift, not born with, learned, through years of practice and failure and deliberate return to the interior. That word is doing more work in that sentence than it looks like. If you're watching this channel, if you're here at this point in this video, there's probably some version of this question alive in you. How do I stop needing things I cannot control? How do I stop organizing my inner life around whether people see me the way I want to be seen? These are not small questions. They are, in fact, among the oldest and most honest questions a person can ask. And if they're stirring in you, I'd ask you to subscribe, not as a transaction, but because this is the kind of territory we return to here, from every angle. The Stoic framework, the psychological dimension, the scriptural wisdom. We don't resolve it in one video, but we keep returning to it. Because the thing we're really building, across every conversation on this channel, is not a set of tactics. It's an interior, a stable place to stand when the outside gets loud. If that's the work you're interested in, stay close. Now, back to where we were. Because there's a final move in the Machiavellian framework, and it's the one that ties everything together. It's not about how you handle an individual accusation. It's about what you become when you stop handling accusations at all. When you no longer live in that register. That is where we're going next. There is a point. And no one can tell you exactly when you'll reach it, because it's not a moment, it's more like a gradual change in weather, where the work we've been describing stops being a practice and starts being a presence. You stop catching yourself before defending yourself. You stop reaching for the explanation and then pulling back. You simply don't reach, not because you're suppressing, but because the thing that used to reach has changed shape. The need has quieted. Not gone, but no longer in charge. This is what Machiavelli's most enduring observation actually points toward, though he framed it in the language of power and princes. He was describing something real. There are people in any room who command it without doing anything dramatic, who seem to occupy more space than their words or their volume would account for, whose presence simply carries weight. And if you study these people, not the loud ones, not the aggressive ones, but the genuinely weighty ones, you find that what they share is not intelligence or charisma or even strength exactly. Or what they share is that they do not seem to need anything from you. They are not hunting for your approval. They are not bracing for your critique. They are just there, complete, oriented towards something you can't fully see, and not particularly interested in explaining it. That quality has a name in the Stoic tradition. It is something close to what they called apatheia. Not apathy in the modern sense, not numbness or disinterest, but the freedom from being driven by passions you did not choose. The freedom of acting from virtue and reason, rather than from anxiety and need. Marcus Aurelius came back to this again and again in his private writing. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, and he wrote to himself every day about the same struggle, the pull toward what others think, the temptation to measure himself against external approval. He did not write as a man who had mastered this. He wrote as a man who was working on it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, issue, not the present as escape from consequences, the present as the only place where freedom actually lives, not in the version of yourself you're trying to persuade the room to believe. In the actual you right now, making choices from somewhere real. When you have done enough of this work, when the practice has run long enough and deep enough, something begins to happen around you. The attacks come less frequently, not because you've become immune in some theatrical sense, but because the people who were inclined to provoke you begin to sense that there's no return on the investment. The bait goes unclaimed. The trap springs and catches nothing. And over time, they simply redirect their energy elsewhere. And you find, quietly, without anyone making an announcement, that you have built something, not a reputation in the anxious sense of something to be managed and defended, but a name, a gravity, a way of being in the room that people feel, even when you haven't spoken. Your silence is no longer an absence. It is a full and weighted presence. This is the full architecture of what Machiavelli's observation actually means when it's carried all the way through, not as strategy, not as manipulation, not as a collection of social tactics, but as the outer face of a genuinely cultivated interior. The man who never needs to explain himself has done the work of becoming someone who no longer doubts himself in the place that counts. His stability is not performed, it is arrived at. And that arrival is what makes the room feel it. The Book of Psalms, in one of its quietest passages, says this, Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still, not be strategic, not be calculating still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of motion, but the presence of something more solid than motion. A rootedness that doesn't depend on the weather outside. That stillness, in the Stoic practice, in the Machiavellian observation, in the scriptural wisdom, is the destination. Not a tactic on the way to winning something, the thing itself, the condition from which a life of genuine authority, over yourself, over your choices, over your days, actually becomes possible. There is no enemy to defeat here. There is only the long, patient, unglamorous work of becoming harder to move, of building a place inside you that the room cannot reach. Start there. Return there every day. And if there is someone in your life, someone who is fighting the wrong battles, defending themselves against shadows, spending their energy on things that are taking from them, share this with them. not as a correction, as company for the work. Tell me in the comments, where do you feel it most? The pull to explain yourself, to defend yourself, to make sure the room has it right. I read every answer, and the question is worth sitting with before you answer it.